Get up. You don't belong here. Those 6 words spat out by a flight attendant in front of a packed first-class cabin were the last mistake she would ever make in her career. She thought she was removing a suspicious passenger to make room for a VIP. She didn't know that the man in the hoodie, the one she was humiliating while security dragged him down the aisle, wasn't just a passenger. He was the man who signed her paychecks. He was the man who owned the very plane they were standing on. And in exactly 5 minutes he was going to remind everyone that, while money talks, true power whispers before it strikes. The blue glow of the laptop screen reflected off Alexander Morgan's tired eyes as he sat in the corner of the SkyBridge Airways executive lounge at JFK International Airport. To anyone watching, Alex looked like exactly what he was trying to appear to be. Just another exhausted traveler in a faded gray hoodie and well-worn jeans, clutching a cracked tablet and nursing his 3rd cup of coffee in the past hour. What they couldn't see was the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders, the burden of running a billion-dollar aviation empire while trying to be the father his 8-year-old daughter, Zara, deserved. Alex rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the stubble that had grown during his 40-hour marathon business trip across 3 countries and 2 continents. The acquisition deal he'd just closed in Singapore would save 1,200 jobs and revolutionize cargo logistics across Southeast Asia. But all he could think about was the video call he'd promised Zara before her bedtime. He glanced at his watch and realized he was already 3 hours late. Again. His phone buzzed with an incoming FaceTime call, and Zara's face appeared on the screen, her gap-toothed smile bright, even though she was clearly fighting sleep. She was sitting in her grandmother's kitchen in Connecticut, still wearing her school uniform with a smudge of chocolate on her cheek. "Daddy, you look sad," Zara said, tilting her head the way she always did when she was trying to read his emotions. "Did your work trip make you lonely again?" Alex felt his chest tighten with a familiar mixture of love and guilt. Ever since Elena had lost her battle with cancer 2 years ago, these moments of connection with his daughter had become both his lifeline and his greatest source of self-doubt. Elena had been the moral compass of their family, the one who reminded him that true success wasn't measured in quarterly earnings, but in the lives they touched along the way. "I'm not lonely, sweetheart, just tired," Alex said, managing a smile that he hoped looked more convincing than it felt. "But seeing your beautiful face makes everything better. How was school today? Did Mrs. Patterson like your book report?" Zara's expression grew serious, and she leaned closer to the camera. "Daddy, why do people judge books by their covers?" Mrs. Patterson said that's what prejudice means when you decide about someone before you really know them. She said Mommy used to write about that in her articles. The question hit Alex like a physical blow, partly because of its unexpected depth, and partly because it reminded him so acutely of Elena. His late wife had been an investigative journalist who specialized in social justice issues, and her final series of articles about inequality in transportation had won a posthumous Pulitzer Prize. Her work had inspired Alex to acquire struggling airlines not just for profit, but to transform their cultures from the inside out. "That's a very grown-up question," Zara Alex said, reaching into his carry-on bag to pull out the worn leather journal that had belonged to Elena. "Mommy wrote something about that once. She said that when people judge others by what they look like or how they're dressed, they miss out on discovering the beautiful person inside." He opened the journal to a page marked with a blue ribbon and read aloud, "Change the world quietly, one heart at a time, until the quiet becomes a roar that drowns out hatred forever." Alex looked back at the camera and saw Zara nodding solemnly, storing away the words the way children do with truths they sense are important. "Are you changing hearts on your trip, Daddy?" Zara asked, and Alex felt the familiar ache of missing Elena's guidance. She would have known exactly how to answer that question, how to explain the complexity of corporate responsibility to an 8-year-old without overwhelming her innocent worldview. "I'm trying, sweetheart," Sometimes, grown-ups need reminders about how to treat people with kindness, especially people who look different from them or come from different places, Alex said. But enough about work. Tell me about your day. Did you finish the art project you were working on? As Zara launched into an enthusiastic description of her watercolor painting of their family cat, Alex felt some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. This was why he worked so hard, why he spent weeks away from home negotiating deals and restructuring companies. Everything he built was for her future, for the world she would inherit. Grandma says I have to go to bed now, but I wanted to tell you something important, Zara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I love you bigger than the whole sky, even when you're far away. I love you bigger than the whole universe, Alex replied, completing their nightly ritual. Sweet dreams, little sparrow. I'll be home tomorrow night and we'll have pancakes for dinner. Deal. But Daddy Zara paused, looking directly into the camera with Elena's eyes. Remember what Mommy wrote. Be kind to everyone, even if they're not kind to you first. After ending the call, Alex sat in silence for a long moment, staring at Elena's journal. He'd been traveling under a false identity for 6 months now, ever since he'd acquired SkyBridge Airways through a shell company to avoid the media attention that typically accompanied his business deals. The airline had been hemorrhaging money and facing multiple discrimination lawsuits when he bought it, and he'd wanted to understand the company's culture before implementing changes. What better way to see how employees treated passengers than to become a passenger himself? He'd learned more in those 6 months about unconscious bias and customer service failures than any boardroom presentation could have taught him. Tonight would be his final undercover flight as Alexander Morgan, regular passenger. Tomorrow he would reveal his ownership and begin the process of transforming SkyBridge Airways into the kind of company Elena would have been proud of. Final boarding call for Flight 447 to London. Heathrow echoed through the lounge, and Alex closed the journal, tucking it carefully into his messenger bag. He walked to the gate, his footsteps heavy with exhaustion, but also with purpose. In 12 hours, he would be home with Zara, and this chapter of his corporate detective work would be complete. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, Alex caught sight of his reflection in the window behind the desk. The man looking back at him did indeed look like someone who might be traveling on miles or an employee discount rather than someone who could buy the entire airport if he chose to. His hoodie was wrinkled from being stuffed into overhead bins across 3 continents. His jeans had a small stain from spilled coffee in the Seoul airport, and his canvas messenger bag looked like it had seen better decades. Perfect, Alex thought, remembering Elena's words about the importance of walking in other people's shoes. Tonight he would experience SkyBridge Airways one final time through the eyes of an ordinary passenger. Tomorrow he would begin the work of making sure every passenger received the dignity and respect that Elena had always believed was every person's fundamental right. He settled into his seat in the gate area and opened Elena's journal again, reading her final entry about transportation equity. The way we treat strangers when they're vulnerable, tired, and far from home reveals who we really are as a society. Airlines aren't just moving people from one place to another. They're creating thousands of moments each day where human dignity either flourishes or withers. The companies that understand this truth will not only succeed financially, they'll succeed morally. Alex smiled, feeling Elena's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. By this time tomorrow, he would have kept his promise to her. SkyBridge Airways would begin its transformation into exactly the kind of company she had envisioned, one interaction at a time. The Boeing 787 gleamed under the terminal lights as Alex walked down the jet bridge, the familiar hum of aircraft engines creating a soundtrack that had become the background music of his life. He paused for a moment at the aircraft door, noting the SkyBridge Airways logo painted on the fuselage with a mixture of pride and apprehension. In 6 months of ownership, he'd learned that logos and mission statements meant nothing if they weren't backed up by genuine cultural change. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, Alex was immediately struck by the contrast between the aircraft's pristine condition and the subtle tension he sensed in the crew's body language. Rebecca Chen, the senior flight attendant, stood near the galley with her shoulders rigid and her smile practiced but not reaching her eyes. At 38, Becca had been with SkyBridge Airways for 15 years, working her way up from economy class to the prestigious international first-class routes. What Alex couldn't see was the stress that had been consuming Becca's life for the past 8 months. Her divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago, and she was locked in a bitter custody battle for her 12-year-old twin sons. Her ex-husband's lawyer had painted her as an absent mother, who prioritized her career over her children, citing her irregular work schedule and overnight trips as evidence. Every passenger interaction now felt like a performance review, every complaint a potential weapon that could be used against her in family court. Alex made his way to seat 1A, his assigned window seat, and stowed his bag in the overhead bin without fanfare. The leather seat was wide and comfortable, and under normal circumstances, he would have appreciated the craftsmanship that had gone into the cabin design. Tonight, however, he was more interested in observing how his crew treated passengers during the boarding process. He pulled out his tablet and opened a document that appeared to be a technical manual, but was actually his private notes about employee behavior patterns he'd observed during his months of undercover travel. So far, SkyBridge Airways scored better than most airlines in terms of safety and efficiency, but there were troubling patterns of inconsistent customer service that seemed to correlate with passenger demographics. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," a voice said sharply from the aisle. Alex looked up to see a man in his early 50s standing over him holding a boarding pass and wearing an expression of irritation that suggested this was not the first inconvenience he'd encountered today. Jonathan Harwick cut an impressive figure in his tailored navy suit, gold watch, and Italian leather shoes, but there was something desperate in his eyes that spoke of a man trying very hard to maintain an appearance of success. Jonathan was indeed desperate, though he would never admit it publicly. His pharmaceutical company, Harwick Biosolutions, was facing a federal investigation by the FDA over safety data that may have been falsified in clinical trials. The investigation was still confidential, but Jonathan knew it was only a matter of time before the story leaked to the financial press. This trip to London was supposed to be his salvation, a merger with a British pharmaceutical company that would provide both legal protection and financial stability. The deal hinged on his ability to project confidence and control starting with this flight. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be a mistake," Alex said calmly, holding up his phone to display his digital boarding pass. "My ticket shows 1A as well." Jonathan's face flushed red as he leaned closer, and Alex caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with what might have been whiskey from an airport bar. "Listen, friend, I fly this route twice a month. I'm a Diamond member of their loyalty program, and I specifically requested this seat for business reasons. Whatever promotional upgrade you're traveling on, it doesn't trump actual paying customers." The dismissiveness in Jonathan's tone was casual and automatic, the kind of assumption that Alex had been documenting for months. Before Alex could respond, Becca appeared at Jonathan's side, having been drawn to the confrontation by years of experience that told her when passenger tensions were about to escalate. "Good evening, Mr. Harwick," Becca said, her voice immediately shifting to the warm, deferential tone she reserved for her most frequent and highest-spending passengers. "I see we have a seating issue. Let me take care of this right away." She turned to Alex, and he watched her expression change subtly as she took in his appearance. The hoodie, the worn jeans, the scuffed sneakers, the messenger bag that looked like it had been purchased at a discount store. Alex had seen this transformation dozens of times during his undercover travels, the instant categorization that determined how much courtesy and effort a passenger would receive. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Becca asked, her voice now cooler and more formal. Alex held up his phone again, and Becca glanced at it without taking the time to properly examine the details. She saw the seat number 1A, but what she missed was the passenger status code that would have identified Alex as the airline's owner. The code HQ1 appeared in small font at the bottom of the digital pass, but Becca was already moving through her mental checklist of how to handle what she assumed was a routine upgrade dispute. "I see the confusion," Becca said, though there was no real confusion on her part. "There seems to be a double booking in the platform, but Mr. Harwick is one of our most valued Diamond members, and he has priority for premium seating. I'm sure we can find you a lovely seat in premium economy, and I'll be happy to provide you with a complimentary drink voucher for the inconvenience." Alex felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. This was exactly the kind of interaction that Elena had written about in her final article, the automatic prioritization of perceived status over actual entitlement. He thought about Zara's question from their phone call about judging books by their covers, and realized this was going to be an unplanned but valuable teaching moment. "I appreciate the offer," Alex said, keeping his voice level and respectful, "but I'm not traveling on an upgrade. I purchased this seat and I was here first. I'm happy to wait while you check with the gate to resolve the double booking, but I'm not giving up my seat based on assumptions about my ticket type." Becca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In her 15 years of experience, passengers who looked like Alex typically became apologetic and accommodating when faced with a conflict involving a Diamond member. His calm refusal to move struck her as inappropriate, even suspicious. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but I need to prioritize the boarding process for all our passengers," Becca said, her professional smile becoming more strained. "Mr. Harwick has connecting flights to catch and important business to attend to. Surely you can appreciate the need for flexibility in these situations." Jonathan smirked and gestured vaguely at Alex's casual attire. "Look at him, Rebecca. Does he look like someone who needs to be in first class for business reasons I'm trying to finalize a merger worth $200 million? My work actually matters." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Alex felt his pulse quicken slightly. This was the moment where he had a choice to make. He could reveal his identity and end this confrontation immediately, or he could see how far his own employees were willing to go based on their assumptions about him. "My work matters to me," Alex said quietly, thinking about Zara and the promise he'd made to Elena about treating every person with dignity. "And my ticket is just as valid as anyone else's." Maya Santos, a civil rights attorney traveling in seat 2B with her 15-year-old son David, had been watching the interaction with growing concern. She'd seen this exact scenario play out before in courtrooms and depositions, the casual discrimination that people in power wielded without even realizing they were doing it. She quietly activated her phone's video camera and positioned it to capture the scene. "Ma'am, this gentleman was clearly here first," Maya interjected politely. "Perhaps the other passenger could take seat 1B, which appears to be empty." Jonathan turned to glare at Maya with the kind of look reserved for people who dare to interfere in situations that don't concern them. "Excuse me, but this is between me and the crew. I don't need input from other passengers." Becca felt trapped between competing pressures. She wanted to maintain her relationship with Jonathan, who tipped well and whose positive feedback could help her performance reviews. But she was also aware that other passengers were watching, and the situation was beginning to attract attention from economy-class passengers still boarding behind them. Sir Becca said to Alex, "I'm going to call our gate manager to resolve this situation, but in the meantime I really must insist that you allow Mr. Harwick to be seated so we can continue the boarding process. You'll be our first priority for rebooking once we're airborne." Alex looked into Becca's eyes and saw something that made him profoundly sad. It wasn't malice or conscious racism, but something perhaps worse, the unconscious bias that Elena had spent her career documenting. Becca genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, prioritizing someone who looked successful over someone who looked ordinary. "I understand you have a job to do," Alex said. "But I'm not moving. If there's a legitimate double booking, then proper procedure would be to verify both tickets with the gate and determine who has the valid claim. What you're asking me to do is give up my confirmed seat based on assumptions about who deserves to be here." Becca's face flushed with frustration and something approaching anger. She pressed the call button on her handheld device and spoke into it quietly. Within minutes, David Kim, the airport's new passenger services manager, appeared at the aircraft door looking harried and overwhelmed. At 35, David had been promoted to his current position just 3 months ago, and he was still learning to navigate the complex politics of airline operations while managing customer expectations. He'd been dealing with holiday travel delays all day, and his supervisor had made it clear that minimizing flight delays was the top priority. David surveyed the scene quickly. A well-dressed businessman, clearly frustrated and checking his watch. A senior flight attendant, obviously eager to resolve the situation, and a passenger in casual clothes who appeared to be the source of the holdup. From David's perspective, the solution seemed obvious. "Sir, I'm David Kim, the passenger services manager," he said to Alex. "I understand we have a seating conflict. I've been authorized to offer you a full refund of your ticket purchase, plus a voucher for future travel if you're willing to take the next available flight to London. That's a very generous offer, considering the circumstances." Alex studied David's face and saw exhaustion, stress, and the weight of someone trying desperately to do a job that felt overwhelming. He also saw the same unconscious bias that had led Becca to automatically side with Jonathan. The assumption that the person who looked more successful must be the person who deserved priority treatment. "What circumstances are those exactly?" Alex asked. David glanced nervously at Jonathan, whose impatience was becoming increasingly visible. "Well, you know the holiday travel season, the need to minimize delays, the general situation. The general situation being that you've decided I don't belong in first class based on how I'm dressed." Alex asked, his voice still calm but carrying a note of steel that made David step backward slightly. "No, sir. That's not what I said," David replied quickly, though they all knew it was exactly what he'd implied. Alex looked around the cabin at the faces watching him. Some passengers appeared uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others seemed curious about how it would resolve, and a few, like Maya Santos, were clearly documenting everything with their phones. He thought about Elena's final article about the thousands of small moments of dignity that were created or destroyed every day in situations exactly like this one. "Then let me be clear," Alex said, standing up slowly and gathering his bag. "I'm leaving this airplane. But not because I'm giving up my seat and not because I don't belong here. I'm leaving because I want to see how far you're all willing to go to defend your assumptions about who matters and who doesn't." He paused and looked directly at Becca, then at David, and finally at Jonathan. "In exactly 5 minutes, you're going to realize that you've made a mistake that will change all of your lives. I hope the lesson you learn is worth the price you're about to pay." The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening as Alex's words hung in the air like a challenge. Jonathan Harwick laughed first, a sharp braying sound that cut through the tension with the efficiency of a blade. "Is that supposed to be some kind of threat?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying the particular kind of amusement that wealthy men reserve for people they consider beneath their notice. "What are you going to do? Write a bad review on social media? File a complaint with customer service? I hate to break it to you, friend, but airlines get thousands of complaints every day from people who think they're more important than they actually are." Becca felt a mixture of relief and vindication as she watched Alex gather his belongings. In her mind, she had successfully diffused a potentially disruptive situation while protecting the interests of a valued customer. The fact that Alex was leaving voluntarily rather than forcing her to call security felt like a professional victory. "I appreciate your cooperation, sir," Becca said, her voice regaining its professional warmth now that the conflict appeared to be resolving in her favor. "I'm sure our customer service team will take excellent care of you when you rebook, Have a pleasant evening." Alex shouldered his messenger bag and looked around the cabin one final time. Maya Santos was still recording her expression grave as she documented what she clearly recognized as a civil rights violation. Her 15-year-old son David was watching with wide eyes, and Alex could see the boy processing what he was witnessing, learning a lesson about power and prejudice that no classroom could teach. "Ma'am," Alex said to Maya, "I hope you'll share that video with the world. People need to see how decisions get made when they think no one important is watching." Maya nodded solemnly. "I will. And I'm sorry this happened to you." As Alex walked toward the aircraft door, he passed through economy class where passengers were still boarding and finding their seats. Many of them looked up as he passed, sensing that something significant had occurred in first class, but not sure what it was. A few elderly passengers shook their heads sympathetically, recognizing the walk of someone who had been unjustly removed from where they belonged. At the aircraft door, Alex paused and turned back to look at David Kim. The young manager was still standing in the first-class aisle, looking uncertain about whether he had handled the situation correctly. There was something in his expression that suggested he knew something wasn't right about what had just happened, but the pressure to keep the flight on schedule had overridden his instincts. David, Alex said quietly, "Before this is over, I want you to ask yourself one question. If I had been wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase instead of wearing a hoodie and carrying this bag, would you have offered Mr. Harwick my seat?" Really think about that question, because your honest answer will tell you everything you need to know about what just happened here. David's face went pale, and Alex could see the realization beginning to dawn that maybe, just maybe, he had made an error in judgment that was much more serious than a simple customer service dispute. Alex stepped off the aircraft and into the jet bridge, where the cool, recycled air immediately felt like a relief after the suffocating tension of the cabin. He pulled out his phone and speed-dialed a number that only 3 people in the world had access to. "Elizabeth." "It's Alex," he said when his assistant answered on the first ring. "I need you to execute Protocol 7 immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Alex could hear the sound of fingers flying across a keyboard. "Sir, are you certain Protocol 7 is irreversible once initiated?" "I'm certain," Alex said, looking back through the small window in the jet bridge door at the aircraft he owned. "Ground Flight 447. Cut all power to the plane except emergency lighting. Contact the FAA and inform them that we're conducting an immediate safety investigation. And Elizabeth," "Yes, sir?" "Call the head of Human Resources and tell her to meet me at Gate 23 in 10 minutes. We're about to conduct some performance evaluations." Elizabeth Connor had been Alex's executive assistant for 12 years, and she had never heard him use the tone he was using now. It was calm and controlled, but underneath the surface she could detect a fury that was white-hot and precisely focused. "Sir, just to confirm, you want me to ground your own flight while you're scheduled to be on it. I want you to ground the flight because I was just removed from it," Alex said. 3 employees of our airline just demonstrated that they believe a passenger's clothes and skin color matter more than their ticket or their dignity. They made that choice while representing our company, our brand, and everything Elena worked to change about this industry. So yes, Elizabeth, I want you to ground the flight. Back on the aircraft, the first sign that something unusual was happening came when the overhead lights flickered and then dimmed to emergency levels. The familiar hum of the auxiliary power unit that provided air conditioning and electrical power to the aircraft suddenly went silent, leaving the cabin in an eerie quiet that made everyone's ears ring. Becca looked around in confusion, her professional instincts immediately shifting into crisis management mode. Power failures were rare on aircraft at the gate, and when they occurred, they typically indicated serious mechanical problems that could delay or cancel flights entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom system, sounding strained and confused. "We've been instructed by ground control to shut down all aircraft power systems and remain at the gate. We're told this is related to an administrative issue that needs to be resolved before departure. We'll have more information for you as soon as it becomes available." Jonathan looked around the cabin with growing alarm. He had a crucial meeting scheduled for early morning in London, and any significant delay could jeopardize the merger deal he desperately needed to close. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "I have important business to conduct. How long is this going to take?" David Kim was standing near the galley, speaking quietly into his radio and becoming increasingly agitated as he received information from ground control. Alex could see him through the jet bridge window, watching as the young manager's confident demeanor crumbled under the weight of a situation he clearly didn't understand. Maya Santos continued recording her legal training, telling her that this was all connected to the incident she had just witnessed. She leaned over to whisper to her son David, "Remember this moment, sweetheart. This is what happens when people in power think they can treat others however they want without consequences." 10 minutes passed in growing discomfort as the cabin temperature began to rise without air conditioning. Passengers started fanning themselves with safety cards and magazines, and several people were calling family members to report delays. The mood shifted from mild inconvenience to genuine concern as it became clear that this was not a routine mechanical issue. Then, through the jet bridge window, passengers in first class could see figures approaching the aircraft. Alex walked back toward the plane, flanked by 3 people in business attire. Elizabeth Connor carrying a tablet and looking grimly efficient. A woman in a Navy suit who introduced herself as Patricia Wells from Human Resources, and James Mitchell, the head of airport security. Becca watched through the window as the group paused outside the aircraft door, and she felt a cold knot of dread forming in her stomach. Something about the way the man in the hoodie carried himself had changed. The defeated passenger who had been escorted off the plane 20 minutes ago now moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything around him. "Oh my God," David Kim whispered into his radio, reading from a text message that had just appeared on his phone. "I think we just made a mistake. A really, really big mistake." The aircraft door opened and Alex stepped back onto the plane. But this time, he wasn't alone, and he wasn't the passenger who had been politely but firmly removed from his seat. This time he was flanked by officials, and his quiet authority filled the cabin like electricity before a lightning strike. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex said, his voice carrying clearly to every seat in the aircraft. "My name is Alexander Morgan, and I am the owner and CEO of SkyBridge Airways." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Jonathan's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. Becca's face went white as she realized the magnitude of what she had done. David Kim looked like he might be sick. 10 minutes ago, I was removed from seat 1A by employees who decided that my appearance was more important than my ticket, my dignity, or my rights as a passenger. Alex continued. I was profiled, discriminated against, and humiliated in front of everyone on this aircraft by people who work for me. Maya Santos had stopped recording because her hands were shaking with the realization of what she had witnessed. This wasn't just a routine case of airline discrimination. This was the owner of the company being subjected to the very bias that his own employees perpetuated every day. "Now," Alex said, looking around the cabin with eyes that missed nothing, "we're going to have a conversation about accountability, about dignity, and about the kind of company I thought I was running versus the kind of company I actually own." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the soft buzz of emergency lighting and the distant noise of other aircraft on the tarmac. Every person on Flight 447 understood that they were witnessing something that would change everything, not just for the employees who had made the mistake, but for the entire industry they thought they understood. Alex reached into his messenger bag and pulled out Elena's leather journal, holding it up for everyone to see. My wife wrote about moments like this before she died. She said that true change happens when good people choose courage over comfort, when they decide that doing the right thing matters more than taking the easy path. Tonight, 3 of my employees chose comfort. They chose assumptions over investigation, prejudice over policy, and convenience over character. He looked directly at Becca, then at David, and finally at Jonathan. Now, they're going to learn what Elena knew all along, that every choice has consequences, and some consequences change everything. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows across the faces of everyone in the first-class cabin as Alex stood in the aisle. Elena's journal still clutched in his hand. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was actually only seconds, as 300 passengers and crew members processed the revelation that had just turned their understanding of power and authority completely upside down. Rebecca Chen felt as if the floor had literally dropped out from beneath her feet. In 15 years of airline service, she had encountered difficult passengers, medical emergencies, severe turbulence, and every other crisis that commercial aviation could throw at her. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. The man she had dismissed as an upgraded economy passenger who didn't belong in first class was not only a legitimate first-class passenger, he was the person who literally owned the aircraft they were sitting in. Mr. Morgan, Becca whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the emergency power systems. I had no idea. The manifest didn't show. The manifest showed exactly what it was supposed to show. Alex interrupted, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made everyone in earshot go silent. What it didn't show was anything that should have mattered to your decision-making process. It didn't show my bank account, my stock portfolio, or my net worth. It showed my name, my confirmed seat assignment, and my valid ticket. That should have been enough. David Kim stood frozen by the galley, still holding his radio and looking like a man who had just realized he'd accidentally triggered a nuclear explosion. The text message on his phone contained 3 simple words from his supervisor: "You are finished." David's mind raced through the implications of what he had done. He had not only removed the airline's owner from a flight, he had done so based purely on assumptions about Alex's appearance and economic status. Jonathan Harwick, who had been so confident and dismissive just minutes earlier, now sat in seat 1A looking like he was watching his life implode in real time. As the head of a pharmaceutical company facing federal investigation, the last thing he could afford was to be associated with a viral incident of workplace discrimination. Every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made had been captured on multiple phones and was probably already being uploaded to social media. Maya Santos, still holding her phone but no longer recording, found her voice first. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Maya Santos. I'm an attorney, and I want you to know that I recorded everything that happened here. If you need witnesses for any legal proceedings, my son and I saw exactly how your employees treated you." Alex nodded gratefully in Maya's direction. "Thank you, Ms. Santos. I hope that video helps people understand that discrimination isn't always dramatic or violent. Sometimes it's quiet, polite, and dressed up as customer service. But it's still discrimination, and it's still wrong." Patricia Wells, the head of Human Resources, stepped forward with her tablet already open to personnel files. As one of the few people at SkyBridge Airways who knew about Alex's undercover ownership, she understood the gravity of what had just occurred. This wasn't just an unfortunate customer service incident. This was a public relations catastrophe that could damage the company's reputation for years. "Mr. Morgan, I've already initiated our standard investigation protocols," Patricia said, her voice professional but tight with barely controlled panic. "I need to interview all involved parties and review security footage from the gate area. This incident will be documented in accordance with our anti-discrimination policies." "Our anti-discrimination policies," Alex repeated, and there was something dark and bitter in his tone that made Patricia take a step backward. "Tell me, Patricia, how many complaints has our company received in the past year about passenger profiling and discriminatory treatment?" Patricia glanced down at her tablet, scrolling through data that she clearly wished didn't exist. "According to our customer relations database, we've received 137 formal complaints alleging discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, or socioeconomic status. An additional 43 complaints mentioned what passengers described as profiling based on appearance or clothing. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Maya Santos's son, David, who had been listening quietly to everything, spoke up with the clarity that only teenagers possess. "Mom, that's almost 200 people who were treated badly just this year. And those are only the ones who complained officially." Alex looked at the teenager with something approaching a smile. "You're absolutely right, David. Most people don't file formal complaints when they're discriminated against. They just never fly with that airline again, and they tell their friends and family about their experience. So multiply those numbers by 10, maybe 20, and you start to understand the real scope of the problem." Elizabeth Connor appeared at Alex's side, her tablet displaying what appeared to be financial data and operational reports. As his executive assistant, Elizabeth had been tasked with monitoring social media engagement and news coverage related to SkyBridge Airways, and what she was seeing on her screen was unprecedented. "Sir, I need to update you on the external situation," Elizabeth said quietly. "Ms. Santos's video has been shared over 2,000 times in the past 15 minutes. The hashtag SkyBridge discrimination is trending on Twitter, and we're receiving calls from CNN, BBC News, and the Associated Press requesting comment." Alex nodded grimly. In the age of smartphones and social media, corporate mistakes could become global news stories in a matter of minutes. But instead of looking concerned about the publicity, Alex appeared almost relieved that the truth was finally coming to light. "Good," Alex said. "Transparency is exactly what this company needs. For too long, we've been able to sweep these incidents under the rug because passengers didn't have the power to make their voices heard. Now they do." Becca, who had been silent since her initial attempt at an apology, finally found her voice again. "Mr. Morgan, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I want you to know that I wasn't consciously trying to—" She stopped, struggling to find words that could possibly explain or excuse what she had done. "You weren't consciously trying to discriminate," Alex finished for her. "But you did discriminate. You looked at my clothes, my bag, my appearance, and you made decisions about my value as a customer based on those assumptions. The fact that it was unconscious doesn't make it less harmful, Ms. Chen. In fact, it makes it more dangerous." Alex opened Elena's journal to a page marked with a red ribbon and began reading aloud. "The most insidious form of prejudice is the kind that good people commit without realizing they're doing it. When someone puts on a uniform and believes they're serving all customers equally but unconsciously provides better service to passengers who look successful, they're not just failing one individual. They're perpetuating a structure that tells entire communities they don't belong." The words hit Becca like physical blows. She thought about her own children, her twin sons who were biracial, and had already started asking her difficult questions about fairness and discrimination. How could she explain to them that she had become exactly the kind of person who made assumptions about people based on their appearance? Jonathan Harwick, desperate to distance himself from the growing scandal, attempted to interject. "Now wait just a minute. I think we're all overreacting here. This was obviously a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. I'm sure if we all just calm down and discuss this rationally." Alex turned to look at Jonathan with an expression that could have frozen water. "Mr. Harwick, you called me friend in the most condescending tone possible, suggested that I was traveling on a promotional upgrade, and told the crew that your work actually matters, while implying that mine doesn't. You made it clear that you believed your perceived status entitled you to take my seat. Was that also a misunderstanding?" Jonathan's face flushed red as he realized that Alex was quoting his own words back to him verbatim. Every dismissive comment, every assumption, every moment of arrogance had been observed and catalogued by the one person on the aircraft who had the power to ensure there would be consequences. I was stressed about my business meetings. I didn't mean anything personal by those comments. I treat everyone with respect, Jonathan stammered, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. Everyone you consider worthy of respect, Alex corrected. The question is, who do you consider worthy and what criteria do you use to make that determination? Because from where I was sitting, it seemed like you were making those judgments based on some very problematic assumptions. Maya Santos spoke up again, her legal training kicking in as she recognized the broader implications of what they were discussing. Mr. Morgan, this incident is emblematic of a much larger problem in the travel industry. Passengers of color, passengers who don't fit certain socioeconomic profiles, passengers with disabilities, they all face this kind of treatment regularly. Most of them don't have the resources or platform to fight back. Alex nodded, and for the first time since reboarding the aircraft, his expression softened slightly. That's exactly right, Ms. Santos, and that's why what happens next matters so much. This can't be just about punishing the people who made mistakes tonight. It has to be about changing the culture that made those mistakes possible. He looked around the cabin, making eye contact with passengers who had been watching the entire drama unfold. Everyone on this aircraft is witnessing something important. You're seeing what happens when unconscious bias gets exposed to the light. The question is, what are we all going to do with this knowledge? Elizabeth cleared her throat gently. Sir, we have representatives from the Transportation Security Administration and the Federal Aviation Administration requesting to interview you about this incident. There are also several civil rights organizations that would like to speak with you about filing formal complaints. Alex closed Elena's journal and tucked it back into his messenger bag. Schedule those meetings, Elizabeth. But first, I want to address our passengers and crew. They deserve to understand what they've witnessed here and what it means for our company going forward. He walked to the front of the aircraft and picked up the PA microphone, his voice echoing through both the first class and economy cabins. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Alexander Morgan speaking. By now, many of you know that I own this airline and that I was just removed from my seat due to discrimination by my own employees. A ripple of murmurs and conversations could be heard from the economy section as passengers who had only heard fragments of what happened in first class began to understand the full scope of the situation. I want you all to know that this flight will not continue tonight, Alex continued. Instead, we're going to use this as a learning moment, not just for SkyBridge Airways, but for the entire travel industry. What happened to me happens to passengers every single day. The only difference is that tonight the person it happened to owns the company. He paused, and the aircraft fell completely silent. By tomorrow morning, every employee at SkyBridge Airways will begin mandatory training on unconscious bias and equal treatment of passengers. We will implement new policies to ensure that passenger status is determined by their tickets and behavior, not by their appearance or perceived wealth. And we will become the industry leader in creating an environment where every traveler is treated with dignity and respect. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of promises made and changes that could not be undone. Everyone in that aircraft understood that they had witnessed a moment that would ripple far beyond this single flight, beyond this single company, and into the larger conversation about equality and justice in America. The aftermath of Alex's announcement hit like a tsunami with consequences spreading outward from Flight 447 in all directions, faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within the aircraft, the atmosphere had shifted from confusion to a mixture of shock, guilt, and in some cases, a dawning understanding of the magnitude of what had just occurred. Rebecca Chen sat in one of the crew seats, her head in her hands, as the full impact of her actions began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket. Her career at SkyBridge Airways was over, that much was certain, but the implications extended far beyond her job. Her ex-husband's custody lawyer would undoubtedly use this incident as evidence of her poor judgment and character, potentially costing her precious time with her twin sons. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to protect her professional standing by pleasing a high-status passenger, she had destroyed not only her career, but possibly her family as well. Patricia Wells, the HR director, approached Becca with the digital termination documents already prepared on her tablet. The speed of the process was both professionally efficient and personally devastating. Ms. Chen Patricia said quietly, "You're being terminated immediately for violation of company policy regarding equal treatment of passengers' discriminatory conduct based on passenger appearance and failure to follow proper verification procedures for seating disputes. You'll need to collect your personal items and leave the aircraft." Becca looked up with tears streaming down her face. "Patricia, I have 2 children. I need this job. I know I made a mistake, but can't there be some other consequence? Additional training, probation, anything." Alex, who had been standing nearby reviewing security footage on Elizabeth's tablet, turned to face Becca directly. "Ms. Chen, you didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to believe that my appearance was more important than my ticket. You chose to trust the assumptions of a passenger who was clearly intoxicated and aggressive rather than follow your own company's policies. You chose to call security rather than verify the facts." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of personal pain. "Most importantly, you chose to do all of this while representing my company, my brand, and the values that my late wife died believing this industry could embrace. Your choices tonight didn't just harm me, they harmed every passenger who will face similar discrimination in the future because people like you refuse to examine their unconscious biases." Becca's shoulders shook with sobs as she signed the termination paperwork. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I believe you are sorry," Alex replied. "But sorry isn't enough. Change is what's required, and change is hard work that has to happen before the moment of crisis, not after." David Kim was experiencing his own reckoning as James Mitchell. The head of airport security explained the consequences of his decision to remove Alex from the aircraft without proper verification. As a manager, David's mistake was not just personal but procedural, representing a failure of leadership that could have legal implications for the entire airport. "David, you're being relieved of your supervisory duties, effective immediately," James said, reading from his own set of personnel documents. "You'll be transferred to ground crew operations for a minimum of 6 months while you undergo retraining in passenger rights, anti-discrimination protocols, and conflict resolution. Your pay will be reduced to reflect your new position, and any future promotions will depend on your demonstrated ability to apply what you learn during this probationary period." David nodded numbly, understanding that his career had just been derailed by a series of assumptions that had seemed reasonable at the time but were now revealed as fundamentally flawed. "Mr. Morgan," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to learn from this. I don't want anyone else to go through what you experienced tonight." Alex studied David's face and saw something that gave him a small measure of hope. Unlike Becca's defensive sorrow or Jonathan's self-serving panic, David's regret appeared to be accompanied by genuine understanding of what he had done wrong. "David, I'm not destroying your career because I'm angry," Alex said. "I'm giving you the chance to rebuild it on a foundation of actual understanding rather than assumptions. 6 months working alongside the people who load bags, clean aircraft, and deal with the passengers you've been managing from a distance will teach you more about this industry than any management training program ever could." Meanwhile, Jonathan Harwick was discovering that his problems extended far beyond the confines of Flight 447. Elizabeth Connor had been monitoring social media and news coverage, and Jonathan's face and voice were now featured prominently in viral videos with captions like, "Executive demands seat from airline owner and when keeping it privileged goes wrong." "Mr. Harwick," Alex said, approaching the pharmaceutical executive who was still sitting in seat 1A, as if refusing to move could somehow undo the events of the evening. "Your behavior tonight wasn't just personally offensive, it was revealing. You demonstrated a worldview that judges people's worth based on their appearance and treats service workers as personal servants rather than human beings. Jonathan looked up with eyes that were equal parts desperate and defiant. Morgan, you can't destroy my entire life over a simple misunderstanding. I have a company to run, employees depending on me, shareholders who will now know exactly what kind of person they've been trusting with their investments. Alex finished. Mr. Harwick, you're banned from SkyBridge Airways for life. You're also banned from the 3 hotel chains and 2 rental car companies that Horizon Dynamics has majority stakes in. But more importantly, I'm forwarding the video of tonight's incident to your board of directors, your shareholders, and the FDA investigators who are currently reviewing your company's clinical trial data. Jonathan's face went white. You can't do that. That's harassment. It's vindictive. It's accountability, Alex said firmly. Character matters, Mr. Harwick. How you treat people when you think they can't fight back tells the world everything they need to know about who you really are. Tonight you showed the world. Elizabeth approached Alex with urgent updates from the outside world. Sir, the story has now been picked up by every major news outlet. CNN is calling it "The Seat Heard Round the World," and the BBC is running a special report on discrimination in the airline industry. More importantly, we're getting calls from other airline CEOs asking for copies of the training protocols you mentioned. Alex nodded grimly. Schedule interviews with the major networks for tomorrow morning. And Elizabeth, call Elena's former colleagues at the Justice and Equality Foundation. I want to establish a partnership with them to develop industry-wide training standards. Maya Santos, who had been quietly observing the consequences unfold, approached Alex with her son, David, beside her. Mr. Morgan, I represent several civil rights organizations, and I want you to know that what you're doing here tonight is exactly the kind of corporate accountability we've been advocating for years. Most executives would have handled this quietly behind closed doors. The fact that you're making this public is going to create real change. Alex looked at Maya's teenage son, remembering Zara's question about judging books by their covers. David, what did you learn from watching all this tonight? The teenager thought carefully before answering. I learned that prejudice isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's quiet and polite, but it's still wrong. And I learned that having power means you have a responsibility to use it to protect people who don't have power. That's exactly right, Alex said. And that's a lesson that every adult on this aircraft needed to hear. As the evening continued to unfold, the ripple effects of Flight 447 spread far beyond JFK Airport. Social media was exploding with discussions about unconscious bias, corporate responsibility, and the treatment of passengers who didn't fit traditional profiles of wealth and success. #SkyBridgeStandard became a trending hashtag, with travelers sharing their own stories of discrimination and calling for industry-wide changes. Patricia Wells received a constant stream of calls from employment lawyers, civil rights attorneys, and federal investigators who wanted to understand the broader implications of what had occurred. The Department of Transportation announced that they would be launching a comprehensive review of passenger rights enforcement across the airline industry, using the SkyBridge Airways incident as a case study. But perhaps most significantly, Alex's phone began ringing with calls from other business leaders who had experienced similar discrimination but had never had the platform or power to address it publicly. A federal judge called to share her experience of being profiled during business travel. A Fortune 500 CEO described being questioned about his first-class ticket because he was young and black. A renowned surgeon talked about being asked to prove her medical credentials when she tried to help during a medical emergency on a flight. This isn't just about airlines, Alex realized as he took call after call from successful professionals who had been diminished and dismissed based on their appearance. This is about a culture that has trained people to make assumptions about worth and value based on surface characteristics. Elizabeth appeared at his side again, this time carrying a tablet with financial data. "Sir, I need to brief you on the market reaction. SkyBridge Airways stock dropped 12% in after-hours trading, but our customer service inquiries are up 300%, and they're overwhelmingly positive. People are calling to book flights specifically because of how you handled this situation." Alex looked around the aircraft one final time, seeing the faces of passengers who had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Some looked uncomfortable, forced to confront their own unconscious biases. Others looked inspired, having seen an example of accountability and justice in action. All of them understood that they had been part of something larger than a simple customer service dispute. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex announced over the PA system one final time, "I want to thank you for your patience tonight. You'll all be receiving full refunds for your tickets, plus vouchers for future travel. More importantly, you'll be receiving an invitation to participate in SkyBridge Airways' new Passenger Advisory Council, where your voices will help shape the policies and training that will prevent incidents like this from happening in the future." As passengers began filing off the aircraft, many stopped to shake Alex's hand or share their own stories of discrimination they had witnessed or experienced. The conversation that had started with assumptions about a hoodie and a seat had become a community discussion about dignity, respect, and the kind of society they all wanted to help create. Maya Santos was among the last to leave, and she handed Alex her business card. "Mr. Morgan, when you're ready to file formal civil rights complaints against other airlines that engage in similar practices, call me. Tonight proved that change is possible, but it's going to take more than one company and one CEO to transform an entire industry." Alex pocketed the card and looked out the window at the dark tarmac where ground crews were preparing other aircraft for departure. "Ms. Santos, I think you'll find that what happened tonight was just the beginning. By tomorrow morning, every airline in America is going to be asking themselves whether their employees would pass the test that mine just failed." The sun was rising over London as Alex sat in the VIP lounge at Heathrow Airport 12 hours after the incident that had already begun reshaping not just his company, but the entire airline industry. He hadn't slept during the overnight flight on a replacement aircraft, instead spending the time on calls with legal teams, civil rights organizations, and other business leaders who wanted to understand how one discriminatory incident had triggered such massive consequences. Elizabeth sat beside him with 2 tablets and a laptop, coordinating what had become a media management operation of unprecedented scale. The story of Flight 447 had gone global, with news outlets in 23 countries running features on airline discrimination and corporate accountability. More importantly, the hashtag change. The industry was trending worldwide, with travelers from every continent sharing videos and photos of their own experiences with discriminatory treatment. "Sir, I need to update you on the overnight developments," Elizabeth said, scrolling through data that seemed to update faster than she could read it. Maya Santos's original video has been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. CNN's interview with her has been shared by every major civil rights organization in the country, and we're receiving calls from airline executives on 5 continents asking for copies of our new training protocols. Alex looked up from Elena's journal, where he had been reading her notes about the multiplier effect of corporate behavior. What Elena always understood was that businesses don't just serve customers, they shape culture. When a company normalizes discrimination, it makes discrimination feel normal. When a company demands equality, it makes equality feel achievable. His phone buzzed with yet another call, this one from Senator Patricia Washington, chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. Alex had been expecting this call since the story broke. "Senator Washington, thank you for calling," Alex answered. "Mr. Morgan, I've been watching the coverage of what happened to you last night, and I want you to know that the Commerce Committee will be holding hearings on discrimination in the airline industry within the next 30 days. I'd like you to testify about your experience and your plans for industry-wide reform." Alex looked out the window at a British Airways aircraft being loaded with passengers and wondered how many of those travelers would be treated differently based on their appearance or perceived status. Senator, I'll be honored to testify, but I hope the hearings will include voices beyond just corporate executives. The passengers who experience this discrimination every day are the ones who really need to be heard. Absolutely, Senator Washington replied. And Mr. Morgan, I want you to know that what you did last night, refusing to let this be handled quietly behind closed doors, that took courage. A lot of CEOs would have fired the employees and moved on. You've started a conversation that this country needed to have. After ending the call, Alex opened his laptop to review the morning's news coverage. The headlines told a story of an industry being forced to confront its own practices. SkyBridge Airways CEO removed from his own flight. Sparks national debate on travel discrimination. When bias goes viral. How one incident exposed airline industry's hidden problem, the hoodie that changed everything. Corporate America reacts to viral discrimination video. But it wasn't just the mainstream media coverage that impressed Alex. The story had sparked organic conversations on college campuses, in corporate boardrooms, and in communities across the country. A group of students at Howard University had organized a Dignity in Travel symposium. Business schools were adding the SkyBridge Airways case study to their ethics curricula. Most importantly, passengers were demanding better treatment and accountability from airlines. Elizabeth's second tablet chimed with breaking news. Sir, American Airlines just announced they're implementing new passenger equality training for all customer-facing employees. Delta has hired a chief diversity officer specifically for customer experience, and United is partnering with the NAACP to develop bias awareness programs. Alex smiled, remembering Elena's prediction that change would spread like ripples in a pond when someone was brave enough to throw the first stone. The beautiful thing about moral leadership is that it forces everyone else to choose what side they want to be on. No airline can afford to be seen as the company that tolerates discrimination after what happened last night. His personal phone rang and Zara's face appeared on the screen. Despite the early hour in London, Alex had promised to call his daughter before her school day began. Daddy, Grandma showed me the news on TV. Zara said, her 8-year-old face serious with concern. She said you were treated badly on the airplane. Are you okay? Alex felt his chest tighten with love for his daughter and gratitude that she was growing up in a world where discrimination was increasingly unacceptable rather than inevitable. I'm okay, sweetheart. In fact, I'm better than okay because what happened helped me make our company better for everyone. Like Mommy wanted, Zara asked, and Alex had to blink back tears at the simple wisdom of the question. Exactly like Mommy wanted, Alex confirmed. She always said that bad things can become good things if we're brave enough to learn from them and strong enough to change what needs changing. Zara nodded solemnly. Daddy, when I grow up, I want to help you make all companies be fair to everyone. I would love that, little sparrow, Alex said. But you know what? You're already helping by asking questions like you asked yesterday about judging books by their covers. Kids like you are the reason adults like me keep working to make the world better. After ending the call with Zara, Alex turned his attention to the stack of message requests from other passengers who had experienced similar discrimination. Elizabeth had been organizing them into categories: racial profiling, religious discrimination, economic bias, and accessibility violations. Sir, there are over 800 individual accounts that people have shared since last night, Elizabeth reported. These aren't just complaints. They're detailed stories of how airline employees have made passengers feel unwelcome, unsafe, or unwanted based on factors that have nothing to do with flight safety or legitimate business concerns. Alex opened a few of the messages at random and felt his anger rekindling as he read story after story of travelers being questioned about their right to be in premium seating, being subjected to additional security screening based on their religion or ethnicity, or being treated with suspicion when they couldn't produce credit cards with high spending limits. One message was from Dr. Aisha Patel, a pediatric surgeon who described being asked to prove her medical credentials when she volunteered to help during a medical emergency, while a white male passenger who claimed to be a doctor was immediately accepted without verification. Another came from James Chen, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who had been asked multiple times during a single flight to verify that his first-class ticket was legitimate, while white passengers around him boarded without question. A third message was from Maria Rodriguez, a federal judge who had been told by a flight attendant that the business-class cabin was probably not for people like her when she asked for assistance finding her seat. "Elizabeth, I want you to compile these stories into a comprehensive report," Alex said. "We're not just dealing with isolated incidents or rogue employees. We're looking at patterns of behavior that suggest unconscious bias is embedded in airline culture across the entire industry." A knock on the lounge door interrupted his thoughts. Maya Santos entered looking professionally polished despite having been on the same overnight flight. Her legal training had been working overtime since the incident, and she carried a briefcase full of documentation that Alex suspected was going to change everything. "Mr. Morgan, I've been in contact with civil rights organizations, passenger advocacy groups, and legal teams across the country," Maya said, setting her briefcase on the table. "Based on the response to last night's incident, I believe we have the foundation for a class action lawsuit that could transform airline industry practices permanently." Alex looked up from the passenger messages he'd been reading. "What are you thinking?" Maya opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "We file federal civil rights violations against the airlines with the worst discrimination records using the passenger stories that have been shared since your incident as evidence. We demand not just financial penalties, but court-mandated changes to training programs, hiring practices, and customer service protocols. The goal being permanent structural change rather than just monetary settlements," Alex said, understanding immediately where Maya was headed. "Exactly. We force every major airline to implement the same kinds of reforms you're putting in place at SkyBridge Airways. We make equality and dignity legally required rather than just good business practice." Alex thought about Elena's final article about the thousands of moments of dignity that were created or destroyed every day in airports and aircraft around the world. "Maya, I want SkyBridge Airways to be the lead plaintiff in that lawsuit. If we're going to demand change from the industry, we need to be willing to subject ourselves to the same scrutiny we're asking for from our competitors." Maya smiled, and Alex could see why she had such a successful legal career. "Mr. Morgan, that's exactly the kind of moral leadership that makes systemic change possible. When the company that was victimized by discrimination is also willing to be held accountable for its own past failures, it sends a message that this is about justice, not just revenge." Elizabeth's laptop chimed with an urgent news alert. Sir Jonathan Harwick's pharmaceutical company just announced his resignation as CEO. The board cited behavior incompatible with company values and mentioned that the FDA investigation into their clinical trials would be handled by new leadership. Alex felt no satisfaction in Jonathan's downfall, only a sense of inevitability. Actions have consequences. Mr. Harwick spent his career believing that his wealth and status exempted him from basic decency. Last night he learned otherwise. Maya gathered her materials and prepared to leave. "Mr. Morgan, I'll be in touch about the lawsuit preparations. But I want you to know that what you've started here is bigger than any legal case. You've given millions of people permission to expect better treatment, to demand dignity, and to speak up when they don't receive it. That cultural shift is worth more than any court settlement." As Maya left the lounge, Alex opened Elena's journal to the final entry she had written before her death. The page was worn from repeated reading, but the words never failed to inspire him. Real change doesn't happen in boardrooms or courtrooms. Though those places matter, Real change happens in the moments when people choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over fear. The person reading this has the power to be that moment of change for someone else. Don't waste that power. Don't let that moment pass. Choose courage. Alex closed the journal and looked out the window at the busy London morning. In a few hours, he would be back on a plane to New York. But this time, he would travel openly as the CEO of SkyBridge Airways, working to ensure that every passenger on every flight experienced the dignity and respect that Elena had dreamed of for the travel industry. Elizabeth gathered her tablets and prepared for the next phase of what had become a global movement. "Sir, are you ready to change the world?" Alex thought about Zara, about Elena, about the 800 passengers whose stories were now demanding justice, and about the millions of travelers who deserved better than they had been receiving. "Elizabeth, I think the world is finally ready to be changed." 6 months had passed since the incident on Flight 447 in the conference room on the 32nd floor of Horizon Dynamics headquarters buzzed with an energy that was both hopeful and sobering. Alex sat at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by civil rights attorneys, former airline employees, passenger advocacy representatives, and the most unlikely group member of all, Rebecca Chen, the former SkyBridge Airways flight attendant whose split-second decisions had triggered a transformation that was still reshaping the entire travel industry. The Elena Morgan Institute for Transportation Equity occupied an entire floor of the Manhattan skyscraper, its mission statement engraved in brushed steel letters across the reception area, ensuring dignity in travel through education, advocacy, and accountability. What had started as Alex's personal response to discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive effort to address unconscious bias across all forms of transportation, from airlines to rideshare companies to public transit. Becca sat quietly at the far end of the table, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to Dr. Patricia Williams, the Institute's Director of Training Programs, present the latest data on airline industry changes. In the 6 months since her termination from SkyBridge Airways, Becca's life had undergone a transformation that was both devastating and enlightening. The custody battle for her twin sons had indeed been affected by her termination, but not in the way she had expected. Her ex-husband's attorney had attempted to use the incident as evidence of poor character, but the family court judge had been more interested in understanding what Becca had learned from the experience. The court-mandated counseling sessions that followed had opened Becca's eyes to unconscious biases she hadn't even realized she possessed. "The data is remarkable," Dr. Williams was saying, clicking through a presentation that showed industry-wide statistics. In the 6 months since the SkyBridge Airways incident, formal discrimination complaints across the airline industry have decreased by 43%. More importantly, passenger satisfaction surveys show significant improvements in reported treatment equality. Alex looked around the table at faces that represented the complexity of real change. Maya Santos had become the Institute's general counsel, coordinating legal challenges that were forcing airlines to adopt standardized training programs. David Kim, the former airport manager who had been demoted to ground crew, now served as the Institute's Director of Employee Relations, using his experience to help other transportation workers understand the impact of unconscious bias. "Becca," Alex said, turning to address the woman whose mistake had started. "Everything I'd like you to share your perspective on the training program you've been developing." Becca looked up, her face showing the strain of the past 6 months, but also a strength that hadn't been there before. "6 months ago, I thought I was a good person who treated everyone fairly. I prided myself on my professionalism and my service record. I had no idea that I was making decisions based on assumptions I didn't even know I was making." She paused, and Alex could see the emotional weight of what she was about to share. "After I was terminated, I spent 3 months feeling sorry for myself, angry at what I saw as an overreaction to an honest mistake. It wasn't until I started volunteering at a homeless shelter and saw how I automatically made judgments about the people I was serving that I began to understand what Mr. Morgan meant about unconscious bias. Dr. Williams nodded encouragingly. What was the breakthrough moment for you? Becca's voice grew stronger as she continued. There was a family at the shelter, a mother with 2 young children who had lost their home due to medical bankruptcy. The mother was articulate, well-dressed, clearly educated. My first thought was, what is someone like her doing here? And then I realized that was exactly the kind of thinking that led me to assume Mr. Morgan didn't belong in first class. I was categorizing people based on my preconceptions about who deserves what kind of treatment. Maya Santos leaned forward with the intensity that made her such an effective attorney. How do you translate that personal revelation into systematic training that can change corporate culture? By making people uncomfortable, Becca said with a directness that surprised everyone in the room. Real bias training can't be a comfortable diversity seminar where everyone nods along and feels good about themselves. It has to force people to confront specific moments when they've made assumptions about others based on appearance, race, economic status, or other factors that shouldn't matter. Alex felt a familiar pang of missing Elena as he listened to Becca describe the kind of difficult conversations that his late wife had been advocating for throughout her journalism career. Becca, tell them about the simulation exercise you've developed. Becca stood and walked to the whiteboard, her confidence growing as she moved into her area of expertise. We've created role-playing scenarios where airline employees experience discrimination from the passenger perspective. A manager who flies first class regularly has to navigate the system as a passenger who fits profiles that typically face additional scrutiny. A flight attendant who assumes passengers in expensive clothes belong in premium cabins has to watch videos of themselves making assumptions about passenger status. She drew a simple diagram on the whiteboard showing interconnected circles labeled awareness, experience, and accountability. The training isn't complete until employees can identify their own biases, understand how those biases affect others, and commit to specific behavioral changes that they'll be held accountable for implementing. David Kim spoke up from his position as Employee Relations Director. The accountability piece is crucial. I thought I was being fair and professional when I removed Mr. Morgan from the aircraft, but I was actually prioritizing what I perceived as the easier solution over what was actually the right solution. If there had been clear protocols that required me to verify passenger information before making seating decisions, the whole incident could have been prevented. Alex looked around the room and felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in what they had accomplished together. Sadness that it had taken such a painful incident to catalyze the change that Elena had been advocating for years before her death. The question we need to address today, Alex said, is how to scale this transformation beyond just the airlines that have been forced to change by legal pressure or public shame. How do we make dignity and equality the industry standard rather than the exception? Dr. Williams pulled up a new slide showing a map of the United States with different colored indicators for various transportation companies. We're proposing the creation of industry certification standards, similar to safety certifications that airlines already have to maintain. Companies would be required to demonstrate measurable progress in bias reduction, employee training, and passenger satisfaction equality in order to maintain their federal operating licenses. Maya Santos smiled with the satisfaction of an attorney who had found the perfect legal strategy. And companies that refused to meet the standards would face the same kinds of federal oversight and financial penalties that are imposed for safety violations. Alex thought about a conversation he'd had with Zara the previous evening when his now 9-year-old daughter had asked him whether the mean airplane people had learned to be nicer. The simplicity of her question had cut to the heart of what they were all trying to accomplish, creating a world where treating people with dignity was so normal that its absence would be immediately notable and unacceptable. There's one more component to this that I want to discuss, Alex said, reaching into his briefcase to pull out a folder marked Personal Accountability Initiative. Elena always believed that real change happens when individuals choose to be better, not just when companies create better policies. I want to establish a program that recognizes and rewards transportation employees who go above and beyond to ensure equal treatment for all passengers. Becca looked up with interest. What would that look like in practice? Alex opened the folder to reveal what appeared to be award certificates and program materials. Monthly recognition for employees who demonstrate exceptional commitment to passenger dignity, scholarships for their children, professional development opportunities, public acknowledgement of their efforts to create positive change. You're creating positive reinforcement for the behavior you want to see more of, Dr. Williams observed. That's brilliant. Most training programs focus on punishing bad behavior, but you're incentivizing good behavior. Maya Santos was already taking notes on her tablet, and from a legal perspective, it creates documentation of industry best practices that we can reference in future discrimination cases. Companies won't be able to claim they didn't know how to train their employees properly. Alex looked at Becca one final time before the meeting ended. Becca, I have a question for you. 6 months ago, you lost your job because of a mistake you made based on unconscious bias. Today, you're helping to train thousands of airline employees to recognize and overcome those same biases. Do you think justice was served? Becca was quiet for a long moment, and Alex could see her carefully considering the weight of the question. Mr. Morgan, justice isn't just about punishment. Justice is about making sure the harm doesn't happen again. If my mistake and my termination help prevent other passengers from experiencing what you went through, then yes, I think justice is being served. Not just for you, but for everyone who will travel more safely and with more dignity because we learned how to do better. Alex closed Elena's journal, which had been open on the table throughout the meeting, and felt her presence in the room as strongly as if she had been sitting beside him. Elena always said that the most powerful form of justice is transformation, not just changing policies, but changing hearts and minds. I think she would be proud of what we've accomplished together. As the meeting concluded and participants began gathering their materials, Alex realized that this conference room conversation represented something much larger than corporate policy reform. It was a microcosm of the kind of difficult, honest dialogue that needed to happen in every industry, every community, and every institution where unconscious bias had been allowed to flourish unchecked. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for the kind of sustainable change that Elena had envisioned. More importantly, the next generation, including his own daughter Zara, was growing up in a world where discrimination was increasingly unacceptable and equality was increasingly achievable. Elizabeth Alex said, as his assistant prepared to schedule the next series of Institute meetings, I want to add one more item to our agenda for next week. I want to invite some of the passengers from Flight 447 to share their perspectives on what they've seen change in the industry. Maya and her son David specifically. I think we could all benefit from hearing how this looks from the perspective of the people who witnessed the original incident. As Alex left the conference room and walked toward the elevator, he passed beneath Elena's portrait, which hung in the Institute's main hallway. Her eyes seemed to follow him, and he could almost hear her voice reminding him that change is a continuous process, not a destination. The elevator doors opened to reveal Zara, who had come to the office after school, as she often did on Fridays. She was wearing her school uniform and carrying a backpack covered with patches from various civil rights organizations that had sent her honorary membership materials after learning about her father's work. "Daddy, how did the meeting go?" she asked as they descended toward the building's main lobby. "Did the grown-ups learn how to be nicer to each other?" Alex smiled and wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Some of them did, sweetheart. And the ones who are learning are teaching other grown-ups how to be better too. It's like what Mommy wrote about change spreading like ripples in a pond." Zara nodded solemnly, then looked up at him with Elena's eyes. "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to help you make sure all the companies treat people fairly. Not just the airplane companies, "I think that's exactly what the world needs," little Sparrow Alex replied, feeling the truth of Elena's prediction that their daughter would grow up to continue the work they had started. "And I think Mommy would be very proud of both of us." 2 years after the incident that had transformed not just SkyBridge Airways, but the entire transportation industry, Alex stood in the departure lounge at JFK Airport, watching as passengers from every background and economic level moved through the gate area with a ease and dignity that would have been unimaginable just 24 months earlier. The changes weren't just visible in policy manuals and training videos. They were evident in the small, everyday interactions between staff and travelers that Elena had always insisted were the true measure of social progress. Zara sat beside him in the same gate area where Flight 447 had originated, now 10 years old, and carrying her own boarding pass for what had become their annual Dignity flight, a journey they took together to commemorate the night that had changed their lives and the lives of countless other travelers. She was reading a book about civil rights heroes, occasionally looking up to watch the gate agents who now greeted every passenger with the same level of respect regardless of their appearance or perceived status. "Daddy, look," Zara said, pointing toward the check-in counter where a young gate agent was assisting an elderly passenger who was having difficulty with the digital boarding process. "She's taking extra time to help him even though there's a long line. Before your airplane adventure, would she have done that?" Alex watched the interaction with the mixture of pride and sadness that had become familiar over the past 2 years. Pride in the cultural changes that were now embedded throughout the industry. Sadness that it had taken a public humiliation to catalyze transformations that should have happened decades earlier. "Before the airplane adventure, as you call it," Alex said, remembering Elena's habit of turning difficult moments into learning opportunities that gate agent might have felt pressured to move the line quickly rather than ensure every passenger received individualized assistance. Now, taking time to treat people with dignity is part of her job training and performance evaluation. Elizabeth approached them, carrying her ever-present tablets, but her expression was lighter than it had been during the crisis management months that had followed the original incident. The Elena Morgan Institute for Transportation Equity had grown from an emergency response to discrimination into a permanent research and advocacy organization with offices in 12 cities and partnerships with civil rights organizations worldwide. "Mr. Morgan, I have the latest quarterly report on industry compliance with the new federal transportation equality standards," Elizabeth said, settling into the seat across from them. "Discrimination complaints are down 67% across all major airlines. Customer satisfaction scores for minority passengers have increased by 43%, and we've had over 12,000 transportation employees complete the Advanced Bias Awareness Certification program." Zara looked up from her book with the kind of serious expression that reminded Alex so powerfully of Elena that it sometimes took his breath away. "That's good. But what about the passengers who don't file complaints? Mommy's articles said that most people who get treated badly don't tell anyone about it." Elizabeth smiled at the 10-year-old who had become an unofficial advisor to the Institute's research programs. "That's exactly what your mom would have asked Zara. We've addressed that by conducting anonymous surveys at airports and tracking social media sentiment analysis. The data suggests that for every formal complaint we used to receive, there were probably 15 unreported incidents. Now that ratio has dropped to about 1 unreported incident for every formal complaint." Alex felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he thought about Elena's absence from moments like these. She would have loved seeing Zara grow into the kind of critical thinker who asked hard questions about justice and accountability. She would have been fascinated by the data showing how corporate culture change could be measured and sustained over time. "There's someone I want you both to meet," Alex said, standing as he spotted a familiar figure approaching from across the gate area. David Kim walked toward them with the confident but humble bearing of someone who had learned hard lessons and emerged stronger for the experience. As the new Director of Passenger Experience for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, David had transformed his career trajectory by embracing, rather than running from the mistakes that had nearly destroyed him 2 years earlier. "Mr. Morgan, Zara," David said, extending his hand in greeting. "It's good to see you both again." Zara stood and shook David's hand with the kind of formal courtesy that Alex had taught her for professional situations. "Mr. Kim Daddy says you help make sure all passengers get treated fairly now." "Is that hard to do?" David's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to answer a 10-year-old's question about systemic change and personal accountability. "It's hard because you have to pay attention to things you never noticed before, Zara. Before your dad taught me about unconscious bias, I thought I was treating everyone equally because I used the same polite words with all passengers. But I wasn't paying attention to whether I made the same assumptions about everyone or whether I gave everyone the same benefit of the doubt when problems arose. Like assuming someone doesn't belong somewhere because of how they look," Zara asked, and Alex realized his daughter had absorbed more from their conversations about the incident than he had realized. "Exactly like that," David confirmed. "Now I have to constantly ask myself whether I'm making decisions based on evidence and policy, or whether I'm making decisions based on assumptions about people that might not be true." Elizabeth looked up from her tablet with news that brought the conversation full circle. "Mr. Morgan, I've been monitoring the latest updates from the Federal Transportation Equality Compliance Review. Jonathan Harwick's former pharmaceutical company has been selected as a case study for how corporate character failures can affect business partnerships. They're losing contracts with transportation companies that don't want to be associated with discrimination scandals." Alex thought about the man who had been so certain of his own superiority and entitlement 2 years earlier, now facing the long-term consequences of behavior that had revealed his true character in a moment of crisis. "Has there been any word from Mr. Harwick personally?" "Actually, yes," Elizabeth said, pulling up an email on her second tablet. "He's written to request a meeting with you. He's apparently been working with addiction counselors and civil rights organizations as part of his personal rehabilitation process. He wants to discuss contributing to the Institute's work." Zara looked up with interest. "Is he one of the mean people who learned to be nicer?" Alex considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. People can change, but real change takes time and hard work. We'll see if Mr. Harwick has done the work." The boarding announcement for their flight interrupted the conversation, and Alex felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Despite all the changes in industry culture and federal regulations, despite the success of the Institute and the measurable improvements in passenger treatment, he still felt a slight anxiety about flying that hadn't existed before the incident on Flight 447. "Mr. Morgan," a voice called from behind them as they gathered their belongings. Alex turned to see Rebecca Chen approaching, but she looked dramatically different from the flight attendant who had made the discriminatory decision that had changed all their lives. Becca now carried herself with the confidence of someone who had confronted her own biases and emerged with a deeper understanding of justice and accountability. As the head of diversity training for the newly formed International Association of Transportation Workers, Becca traveled constantly speaking at conferences and training sessions about unconscious bias and customer service equality. Becca Alex said genuinely pleased to see her. How was the conference in Chicago? Becca's smile was warm, but carried the weight of someone who had learned difficult truths about herself and the world she worked in. Challenging, but encouraging. We had over 800 airline employees from 47 different companies attend the training. The most powerful session was when passengers shared their stories about discrimination they'd experienced. It's one thing to talk about bias in the abstract. It's completely different when you hear specific people describe how your assumptions and prejudices made them feel. Zara looked up at Becca with curiosity. "Miss Chen, when you made the mistake with my daddy, did you know right away that you were being unfair?" Becca knelt down to Zara's level, treating the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No, sweetheart, I didn't. That's what made it so dangerous. I thought I was doing my job correctly, following normal procedures, making reasonable decisions. I had no idea that I was treating your father differently than I would have treated a passenger who looked more like what I expected a first-class passenger to look like. But you know now, Zara pressed, and Alex could see Elena's journalistic instincts in his daughter's refusal to accept simple answers to complex questions. Now I know that I have to constantly question my assumptions and check my decisions against objective criteria rather than subjective impressions, Becca replied. It's harder work than I thought it would be, but it's the most important work I've ever done. As they prepared to board the aircraft, Alex reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The flight attendant who had discriminated against him was now one of the most effective advocates for bias awareness in the industry. The airport manager who had removed him from his own plane was now leading passenger rights initiatives. The man who had demanded his seat was beginning a long process of personal reckoning with his own prejudices and entitlement. Daddy, Zara said as they approached the gate. Do you think Mommy can see all the changes that happened because of your airplane adventure? Alex looked at his daughter at the bustling gate area where passengers of every background were being treated with equal dignity, at the airline employees who now received ongoing training about unconscious bias at the federal regulations that had transformed industry practices, and felt Elena's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside them. I think Mommy is very proud of all of us. Little sparrow, Alex said. She always believed that one moment of courage could create ripples that changed everything. I think she's watching those ripples spread farther than any of us imagined they could. As they boarded Flight 1247 to Los Angeles, Alex noticed that the flight crew greeted every passenger with the same warmth and attention regardless of their seat assignment or appearance. The gate agent had checked identification and boarding passes with equal care for all travelers. The security checkpoint had processed all passengers using identical procedures. These small changes multiplied across thousands of flights and millions of passengers represented the kind of transformation that Elena had devoted her career to advocating. Zara settled into her window seat beside Alex and opened her Civil Rights Heroes book to a chapter about Ruby Bridges, the 6-year-old who had integrated New Orleans schools in 1960. Daddy, do you think I could be brave enough to change things the way Ruby Bridges did? Alex looked at his remarkable daughter, who asked hard questions about justice, held adults accountable for their promises, and insisted that fairness should be normal rather than exceptional. Sweetheart, I think you're already changing things just by expecting the world to be better than it is and refusing to accept discrimination as normal. As their flight taxied toward the runway, Alex opened Elena's journal to the final entry. She had written the words that had guided his decision-making throughout the past 2 years. Real change doesn't happen in boardrooms or courtrooms, though those places matter. Real change happens in the moments when people choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and love over fear. The person reading this has the power to be that moment of change for someone else. Don't waste that power. Don't let that moment pass. Choose courage. The aircraft lifted off into the clear New York sky, carrying father and daughter toward another day of work that Elena had made possible, another opportunity to ensure that dignity in travel became so normal that its absence would be immediately unacceptable to everyone who witnessed it. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the SkyBridge Airways Executive Lounge as Alex and Zara prepared for what had become their most meaningful annual tradition, the commemorative flight on the same route where discrimination had been transformed into a movement for dignity and justice. But this year's flight held special significance because it marked 3 years since the incident that had changed not just their lives, but the entire culture of an industry. Zara, now 11 years old and carrying herself with the confident grace of someone who had grown up watching her father turn personal pain into public progress, sat reviewing a speech she had prepared for the annual Transportation Equality Summit they would attend in Los Angeles. As the youngest keynote speaker in the event's history, Zara had insisted on writing her own remarks rather than allowing adults to craft her message. "Daddy, listen to this part," Zara said, looking up from her notes. "I want to tell the audience that discrimination isn't just wrong because it hurts people's feelings. It's wrong because it wastes human potential. When adults make assumptions about what kids can do based on how we look or where we come from, they miss out on all the amazing things we might contribute to the world." Alex felt his heart swell with pride and a familiar ache of missing Elena, who would have been astonished and delighted by their daughter's sophisticated understanding of justice and equality. "That's a powerful message, little sparrow. Mommy always said that discrimination doesn't just harm the people who experience it directly, it impoverishes the entire community by preventing everyone from benefiting from each other's talents." Elizabeth approached their table carrying what had become a much lighter load of tablets and documents. The crisis management phase of their work had evolved into sustained institutional change, and the Elena Morgan Institute for Transportation Equity now operated with the kind of systematic effectiveness that Alex knew Elena would have admired. "Mr. Morgan, I have some remarkable news to share before we board," Elizabeth said, settling into the chair across from them. "The Department of Transportation has just released their annual report on discrimination in commercial aviation, and the numbers are extraordinary." Alex looked up from his own notes for the summit, where he would be presenting a case study on how one incident of bias could catalyze industry-wide transformation when handled with transparency rather than defensiveness. Discrimination complaints across all major airlines have decreased by 78% compared to pre-incident levels. Elizabeth continued. Customer satisfaction scores for minority passengers have reached parity with overall passenger satisfaction for the first time in the history of the industry. And perhaps most significantly, exit interviews with airline employees show that 86% report feeling more confident and effective in their jobs since implementing bias awareness training. Zara looked up from her speech with the kind of analytical expression that reminded Alex daily of Elena's journalistic instincts. "That last statistic is really important, isn't it? It means that treating people fairly doesn't just help passengers, it helps employees feel better about their work too." "Exactly right," Alex confirmed. "When people can take pride in treating everyone with dignity, they feel better about themselves and their contributions to the world. Discrimination creates a toxic culture that hurts everyone, even the people who think they're benefiting from it." A gentle commotion near the lounge entrance caught their attention, and Alex looked up to see a group of familiar faces arriving for the commemorative flight. Maya Santos approached with her son David, now 18, and preparing for his freshman year at Harvard Law School, with plans to follow his mother into civil rights advocacy. Behind them walked Rebecca Chen, whose transformation from the flight attendant who had discriminated against Alex into one of the most effective bias training experts in the industry had become a case study in personal redemption and institutional change. Alex Zara Maya called out, her voice warm with the familiarity of colleagues who had spent 3 years working together to transform an industry. "David has something he wants to share with you before we board." David Santos Miller had grown into a confident young man whose understanding of social justice had been shaped by witnessing discrimination and its consequences firsthand on Flight 447. His college application essay about that experience had been published in major newspapers and had inspired thousands of young people to pursue careers in civil rights advocacy. Mr. Morgan, David said, shaking Alex's hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested he was already thinking like the attorney he planned to become. "I wanted to let you know that my law school admissions interview focused entirely on what I learned from watching you handle discrimination with dignity and strategic thinking rather than just anger." The admissions officer said that witnessing accountability in action had shaped my understanding of justice in ways that most applicants my age hadn't experienced. Alex felt a familiar tightness in his throat as he considered how one night of humiliation had rippled outward to influence the career path of a teenager who might someday argue civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. "David, The fact that you chose to see that incident as a lesson about justice rather than just a moment of conflict tells me everything I need to know about the kind of attorney you're going to become. Becca approached with her characteristic blend of professional confidence and personal humility that had made her such an effective advocate for change within the airline industry. Alex, I have an update that I think will interest you. The International Association of Transportation Workers has voted to make bias awareness training mandatory for all member organizations, not just airlines. Bus systems, rail companies, rideshare platforms, even taxi commissions are going to be required to implement the protocols we developed. Zara looked up with excitement. That means the changes are spreading beyond just airplanes. That's exactly what it means, Becca confirmed. Your father's decision to make his experience public rather than handling it quietly behind closed doors has created a standard that's being applied across every form of transportation. The ripples keep spreading. Elizabeth consulted her tablet for the boarding announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for Flight 447, commemorative service to Los Angeles. And I have a surprise that I think you'll all appreciate. They gathered their belongings and walked toward the gate where Alex noticed that other passengers were looking at their group with recognition and respect rather than curiosity. The story of Flight 447 had become part of American cultural literacy taught in business schools as a case study in crisis management and corporate responsibility, discussed in sociology classes as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change. As they approached the aircraft, Alex was struck by how profoundly the entire boarding experience had changed. Gate agents greeted every passenger with genuine warmth. Security personnel treated all travelers with consistent respect. Flight attendants welcomed passengers aboard with equal enthusiasm, regardless of their seat assignments or appearance. These changes had required extensive training, policy reform, and cultural transformation, but they were now so embedded in industry practice that younger employees couldn't imagine working any other way. Mr. Morgan, a voice called from behind them as they entered the jet bridge. Alex turned to see a man approaching whom he hadn't expected to encounter: Jonathan Harwick, looking dramatically different from the arrogant pharmaceutical executive who had demanded Alex's seat 3 years earlier. Jonathan appeared older, more subdued, and carried himself with the kind of careful humility that suggested someone who had undergone profound personal reckoning. Jonathan Alex said, his voice neutral but not hostile. I understand you've been working with addiction counselors and civil rights organizations. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious and without any trace of his former arrogance. Alex, I wanted to speak with you before your flight because I've spent the last 3 years trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could treat another human being the way I treated you that night. I've been sober for 18 months. I've been working with therapists who specialize in privilege and entitlement issues, and I've been volunteering with organizations that serve populations I spent my career dismissing or ignoring. Zara looked up at Jonathan with the kind of direct gaze that adults often found unsettling. Mr. Harwick, when you were mean to my daddy, did you think about whether you were being fair? Jonathan knelt down to Zara's level, meeting her eyes directly in a way that demonstrated significant personal growth from someone who had once dismissed entire categories of people as beneath his notice. Zara, I didn't think about fairness at all. I only thought about what I wanted and what I thought I deserved. I never considered that other people had the same rights and dignity that I claimed for myself. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. Alex studied Jonathan's face and body language, looking for signs of genuine transformation versus performative rehabilitation. Jonathan, what do you want from this conversation? I want to contribute to the work you're doing through the Institute, Jonathan said, standing and facing Alex directly. I've liquidated my remaining assets to create a foundation that provides bias awareness training for corporate executives and business leaders. I want to use my experience as someone who embodied privilege and entitlement to help others recognize and change those patterns before they cause the kind of harm I caused. Maya Santos, who had been listening to the conversation with her attorney's instincts for evaluating sincerity, spoke up. Jonathan, accountability isn't just about acknowledging what you did wrong. It's about demonstrating sustained commitment to doing better. What evidence can you offer that this transformation is genuine and permanent? Jonathan reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. These are letters from the organizations I've been working with for the past 18 months, references from the therapists and counselors who've been helping me understand how privilege and addiction created the worldview that led to my behavior on Flight 447. Financial records showing that I've donated over $2 million to civil rights organizations without any publicity or recognition. Alex looked through the documents, impressed, despite himself, by the evidence of genuine engagement with difficult personal work. Jonathan, what you did that night was the culmination of years of believing that your wealth and status exempted you from basic human decency. If you've truly changed, then you understand that redemption isn't a destination. It's a daily choice to treat others with the dignity you want for yourself. I understand that, Jonathan said quietly. And I understand that forgiveness isn't something I'm entitled to just because I've done some work to become a better person. I'm hoping to earn the opportunity to contribute to positive change, not to be absolved of my past behavior. Zara tugged on Alex's sleeve and he leaned down to hear her whisper. Daddy Mommy's journal says that people can change if they're willing to do hard work. Has Mr. Harwick done hard work? Alex looked at Jonathan's face, then at the documentation of his efforts to understand and address his own biases, then back at his daughter who was asking exactly the kind of question that Elena would have asked. I think Mr. Harwick has done some hard work, sweetheart. The question is whether he'll keep doing it even when it's difficult and no one is watching. Elizabeth approached with the final boarding call announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to board Flight 447, and I can now reveal the surprise I mentioned earlier. They walked onto the aircraft together, and Alex immediately noticed that this was not a standard commercial flight. The entire first-class cabin had been reconfigured as a mobile conference room with facing seats and presentation screens that would allow them to conduct institute business during the flight to Los Angeles. This is incredible, Maya said, looking around at the setup. We can hold our summit planning session while we travel to the actual summit. Becca moved toward the front of the cabin with the confidence of someone who had transformed a career-ending mistake into expertise that was reshaping an entire industry. Alex, I'd like your permission to use this flight as a training exercise. We have passengers from various backgrounds and airlines on board today, and I think it would be valuable for them to hear directly from you and Zara about what discrimination looks like from the passenger perspective. Alex looked at his daughter, who was already reviewing her speech notes with the kind of focused preparation that reminded him powerfully of Elena's pre-interview rituals. What do you think, little sparrow? Are you ready to help educate the adults? Zara looked around the cabin at the faces of airline employees, civil rights advocates, and transportation industry leaders who had come together to commemorate the incident that had changed all their professional lives. Daddy, I think this is exactly what Mommy would have wanted. She always said that education happens best when people share their real experiences, rather than just talking about problems in the abstract. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Alex felt a profound sense of completion and continuation. The seat where he had been humiliated 3 years earlier was now occupied by his daughter, who was preparing to address a cabin full of adults about dignity, fairness, and the ongoing work of creating a more just society. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain announced over the intercom. This is Captain Rodriguez speaking. I had the honor of being the pilot of the original Flight 447 3 years ago, and I want you all to know that serving as captain for today's commemorative flight is one of the greatest privileges of my 30-year career. We're cleared for takeoff, and I have a feeling this is going to be a flight that none of us will ever forget." As the aircraft lifted off into the clear Manhattan sky, Alex opened Elena's journal to the final page and read aloud the words that had guided every decision he'd made since that transformative night. "The measure of our character is not whether we never make mistakes, but whether we learn from our mistakes and use that learning to prevent others from experiencing the same harm. Real justice isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. And real transformation happens one heart, one mind, and one moment of courage at a time." Zara looked out the window at the landscape passing below them, then back at the cabin full of adults who were working together to ensure that discrimination would become increasingly unacceptable and equality would become increasingly normal. "Daddy," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom that Alex had come to expect from Elena's daughter. "I think Mommy's words are still changing the world, just like she hoped they would." Alex wrapped his arm around his remarkable daughter and felt Elena's presence as strongly as if she were sitting in the seat beside them. The flight that had begun with humiliation and discrimination had become a journey toward justice and dignity that would continue long after any of them could imagine. Below them, millions of travelers were moving through airports and boarding aircraft, where they would be treated with respect and equality, because one man had chosen transparency over silence, accountability over defensiveness, and transformation over retribution. And above them, somewhere in the vast blue sky, Elena's spirit soared with the knowledge that her words had indeed changed the world one heart at a time, until the quiet had become a roar that drowned out hatred forever. 5 years after Flight 447, the Elena Morgan Institute for Transportation Equity had become a global organization with partnerships spanning 6 continents, and its impact extended far beyond the aviation industry. Discrimination complaints across all forms of transportation had decreased by 83% worldwide, with customer satisfaction scores reaching historic levels of equality. Rebecca Chen now served as the Institute's Director of Global Training, having personally educated over 40,000 transportation employees about unconscious bias and its consequences. David Kim had been promoted to Regional Director of Passenger Experience for the entire Northeast Corridor, implementing dignity protocols that were now standard practice throughout the industry. His 6-month demotion to ground crew had taught him lessons about respect and empathy that no management training program could have provided. Maya Santos had successfully litigated 12 major civil rights cases that established legal precedents protecting passenger dignity, while her son David was completing his first year at Harvard Law School with a focus on transportation justice. Jonathan Harwick's transformation had proven genuine and sustained, with his foundation providing bias awareness training to over 500 corporate executives and donating $8 million to civil rights organizations. His public speaking about privilege entitlement and personal accountability had become a powerful tool for helping other business leaders recognize and address their own unconscious biases. Most significantly, Zara Morgan had grown into a confident 13-year-old, whose understanding of justice and equality continued to guide the Institute's youth education programs, ensuring that the next generation would grow up in a world where discrimination was immediately recognizable and universally unacceptable. And somewhere in the vast network of airports, aircraft, and transportation hubs around the world, Elena's final words continued to echo in the daily choices of countless employees who had learned that treating every passenger with dignity wasn't just company policy, it was a moral imperative. Change the world quietly, one heart at a time, until the quiet becomes a roar that drowns out hatred forever. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make the world more fair and just. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these crucial stories that need to be told. Share this video with your family, friends, and community, because these stories of standing up for what's right, especially when it's difficult, need to reach as many people as possible. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you witnessed or experienced discrimination, and how you think we can all work together to create a world where every person is treated with the dignity they deserve.